Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do on the Kid Lit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature, picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels too. Whether you're an adult reading to your inner child or connecting the young readers in your lives with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. Each week, we'll talk to a different children's literature author and discuss their books, their hopes and dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. So, grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of Kid Lit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Kid Lit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie, here with a new conversation with a children's literature author today. I'm talking with Nic Yulo, an author illustrator with two books out in the Kid Lit world, Patch of Sky and Out of the Blue. Both are beautiful picture books with delightful, bright, colorful illustrations and important messages. Nic, welcome to the Kid Lit Love podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Me too. For those of us that might be meeting you or hearing about you for the first time, I'd love if we could begin with introductions, because I think you have this really amazing backstory where you're not just an author illustrator, but writer director, which I find fascinating. So I would love if you could start there and just give us a little bit about yourself and how you came into the Kid Lit picture book world.
Yes, so I have wanted and have written for most of my life. I think what's fun to me to look back on this story is to see just how much other people, particularly teachers, have had an effect of the course of my life. It's been sort of a series of fortunate detours. Um, so for as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated with stories. I had the very deep fortune of having a great grandmother who did a lot of improv. So she used to she spent a lot of her nights with me. Would sleep on one of those pull-out beds underneath my bed, and I would badger her for stories
Oh, I love it.
constantly. Yeah, it's amazing. And looking back now as an adult, I'm like, how did this woman come up with original stories every single night? It's amazing. So that sort of started that need in me to make things up. Um, and so that writing then to me was a very intimate, private thing. And I think it took literal years for me to overcome that mental hurdle of like, maybe I should share these.
Mhm.
So I went to college at Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania. And again, I was always a kid that was very quiet, leaned towards academics. I was going to be a computer science major, very practical. And the first fortunate detour was that I had an opening in my schedule. The only thing that fit that opening was an art class. And we were all sketching on the grass. That painting professor then talked me out of computer science and into art. So she was the first detour. I then took a creative writing class, which just so happened to be taught partially by David Wiesner. And he made us do picture book dummies. So that's the first time I'd ever connected in my head that I could do art and writing at the same time for a particular purpose. And that truly like changed the course of everything. It still took me a few years to figure out that I could do this as a career. But looking back now, I now live in my dream city as a professional writer. I got a master's in screenwriting and film directing from Columbia and have just been very, very fortunate in the projects I've been able to be a part of.
I love that. And I have a new term that I'm going to use a lot now, which is fortunate detours. And at first, as a reader, as an educator myself, the instant phrase that came to mind was the series of unfortunate events.
Yeah.
And I love how you flipped it into this fortunate detour, this, the way the universe is kind of whispering to you that this could be the way for you. And of course, as an educator, I love that it was a teacher that kind of convinced you and gave you that nudge.
And that doesn't go without saying that I put up a lot of resistance at first, like with that first professor. I think when writing is such a private thing that you use for processing your emotions, becomes very difficult to want to share that with someone. It's very frightening to overcome that first step. So it really took me a long time to even get Patch of Sky out in the world to find an agent.
So what made you take the leap? What changed your mind or gave you the bravery or the courage, or because you do have some wonderful themes in your book about courage and connection, and so I'm curious what gave you yours?
Yeah, so I think at that point there had been a lot of pressure built up from not sharing things. And I was in grad school when I read that article about how pigs, the way that their necks are built, makes them unable to look up. And I was like, that's ridiculous. I need to fix this. And it was in my wanting to fix this that I came up with the main character. And that story just kind of came out without much effort. And I was like, okay, if there's anything that I will put out there, it has to be this, apparently. And I remember being, because I was working on a video game at the time, I was on a motion capture set and had been trying to talk myself out of querying agents for weeks. I don't know, again, looking back, why I gave myself so much resistance. And this has become like a joke at this point, but I emailed my dream agent, who is now my agent, Allie, and she responded 5 minutes after I sent that email. So like the momentum had, I think it took a long time to get there, but the moment we did, things happened very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm finding that's how, the universe works. Once
Yeah.
you kind of make up your mind and you've got that feeling out there, things can line up for you, which it sounds like it just had this kind of beautiful effect. And for listeners that don't know, the book, your first book, I'd love for you to give an introduction to your first book, Patch of Sky, because when I first read the first couple of pages, I did the same thing. I went, wait, what? Pigs can't see the sky? How is that possible that pigs can't see the sky? And so I love that this, random thing that you stumbled upon just became this beautiful picture book that is now kind of teaching readers, kids everywhere. First of all, this really cool fact, which we might not know. And then, of course, the beautiful story that comes after it. But could you tell listeners a little bit about Patch of Sky? That was your first picture book?
Of course. So these two books lean a little STEM. And when again I came across that article, I felt a very strong sense of injustice. And the main character of Pia, I feel like popped up immediately from my brain as someone who wanted to fix a problem. So in my mind, she was a very determined little girl whose best friend just happens to be Patches the pig. She finds this out in the course of the story and is like, this is unacceptable. I need to fix this. And so most of the book is her trying to devise ways to get Patches to see the sky. And it takes her thinking unconventionally to actually succeed. And it's really about friendship and what you're willing to do for your friend and how you want to share things that have an impact on you with people that you love or animals that you love. So that happened very seamlessly, I would feel. It's also my first author illustrator debut. So that was another hurdle that I had to get past, was like, I have to draw this thing. How am I going to do this? And being a huge fan of people like David Wiesner and also growing up reading a lot of comics, like the art of the panel has always been a huge thing for me. And I think my brain was just in that mindset because I was studying film at the time of like, what do we see on screen? So there's a lot of like light panel work in the book that I'd like to think is an introduction to comics for very young readers.
Mm. Yeah, I could feel that as a reader, especially because I'm looking at both books and they are very different in
Yeah.
terms of, well, there's similarities, of course, but differences in terms of the colors and the backgrounds and the way that things pop out, that it is impossible not to kind of jump in to the squares on the page. They're just delightful. They're fun and
Thank
they're
you.
delightful. And I mean, when you think of the story of your first book, a little girl wanting to help her pig see the sky, like that's just delightful. It's a book that I don't know, I just felt really good after closing that last page. Yeah, it's a feel good story that I know listeners
Definitely.
who haven't read it yet are going to love. Now, your second book, I kind of teased to it a little bit, but that is Out of the Blue. Also has a STEM slash science slash curiosity kind of focus. Why don't you tell listeners a bit of backstory about that one?
Sure. So, Out of the Blue to me is my ode to quiet kids, of which I continue to be one. I remember, I mean, we talked a little bit of how writing was the way I processed emotions and the world. It took, I feel like childhood as an introverted kid is not the easiest thing. Um, you are not given a lot of ways to deal with what seems to be an educational system that rewards extroversion. And I really wanted a book that talked about bigness and smallness and like the feeling of invisibility. And sort of a way to show kids that we're more quiet like me, like this could be a superpower. Because in being quiet, you tend to notice things that get overlooked. So Coral, another two pair consonant names. So Coral and Kraken are the main characters of this book. And Coral is a very quiet kid who goes on a field trip to an aquarium. And in researching this book, I spent a lot of time in the Museum of Natural History here in New York because I like doing a lot of research, and I started to look at all of the fish. And there's a small bioluminescent exhibit in the marine wing. And I just like the idea. Again, I read very many things, and I had stumbled on a bioluminescence article. This particular octopus is based on a real octopus. And I like the idea that as a literal defense mechanism to survive, this octopus can be quote unquote invisible. And what could this creature then teach a little girl who feels invisible in her class? And that's what happened.
It is what happened, and it's beautiful and it's delightful. Um, I always wrestle here on the podcast with how much do you say versus how much do you spoil versus what don't you say. So I'm not going to give up my favorite line of the book. You know what that favorite line is. I'm not going to say it because I think there's something special about turning that last page and seeing it for themselves. So instead, I'm just going to say it's a delightful story with the most wonderful message. Um, and then talk about the illustrations because just as I love them in Patch of Sky, they're just fun and engaging and inviting. And what I really loved, and I think it's just what I love about picture books in general too, is you so wonderfully captured, I think, the feelings of Coral as she moved through the book. So at first, the pages are these bright white backgrounds with these bright, beautiful colors. And then as she goes into that bioluminescence room and she's, feeling small and she wants some peace and quiet, the backdrop turns to black and then everything else pops up in the color. And I just loved that switch, that contrast, because it made the mood change, the feeling change, the emotions change. Was that something you knew you wanted to do right away? Did that come to be as you were figuring out how to illustrate the story? How did that whole process happen? Because I'm fascinated by it.
Yeah, it actually also ties into how in Patch of Sky there's a lot of white space, if you noticed. And I like the idea of inverting that. And I kind of had an idea that I wanted the pages to eventually be more dark colors as opposed to light colors. There was a long sort of process of how do you exactly depict bioluminescence on a page that
Right.
makes it clear and also fits into the theme of what you're trying to say. And I had an incredible team at Dial. My editor and art director were very patient in trying to like, let's figure out how we're going to do this. When exactly are we going to transition to that full black background page. How empty should that page be even when she feels alone and abandoned and her class leaves her in the aquarium? So that it was a continuous process of trying to figure out how best can we communicate her emotions, because most of the story is that transition that she undergoes from feeling sort of locked away, alone, feeling extremely alone, dark night of the soul, literally, there's nothing else on the page. And then she kind of comes back to life and suddenly, literally and figuratively, sees all of the colors that everyone else has overlooked.
Yeah, and that's the transition I love. So she went from being in a completely black background to then a black background with some gray
Yeah.
shadow kinds of things, still not feeling so sure about here. And then it switches to the color as she starts to figure out the whole message behind the story, which of course I'm not giving away at the very end. That was my favorite part, the transition part, seeing that change. And what it's funny, I actually just instinctively, I guess, I'm a sticker girl. I love stickers, have always loved stickers. I'm the adult with stickers all over her journal. And that one page, I wanted to like grab her. I just wanted to lift it off the page because it was this black background and this adorable little girl with this expression on her face. So, I think some stickers should be in your future because I would buy some stickers of Coral as a reminder of the message that I'm not going to reveal at the end of the book. Yeah. If I could give you a wish list, that's what it would be.
That's an amazing idea, actually, particularly because she has a white border around her, because that was
Yes.
another thing of like the black outlines. If you put a black outline on a black background, you lose the outline. So how do we keep that structure without losing things?
Yeah. That's why I thought that was like why my hand instantly went to peel it off. Like, oh no, because I love mantras, I love symbols, and I could just like hold it, and
Yeah.
kind of take that message with me. So just tuck it away somewhere.
Noted.
So what is your hope for these two books? I know you may have some other projects coming, but as I mentioned, they're both beautiful. They both have wonderful messages. I think both for children and adults too. We kind of feel the same things in them. What is I guess your hope readers, children will walk away from after reading your books?
Yeah, I think this ties back into the series of Fortunate Detours. I remember one of my professors saying that you should write the book that you wanted as a kid, that you kind of looked for but could never find. And I feel like this is true for anything that I write, is I tend to write about underdogs, like finding your place in the world, overcoming fear. And my basic hope is just that kids and adults who read these books just feel seen,
Yeah.
and maybe come away with it feeling a sense of empowerment, especially if you're someone that has ever felt overlooked, by introversion or feeling a little bit too weird and you've never felt like you belonged. Like I hope you see yourself in this and you come away with a very good feeling.
Yeah. And we do. We do. As a reader who did, I know we talked right before we hit record. I may not have been the physically smallest kid, but we all have those times where we might feel it, if whether we're the shy one or the one that doesn't have a lot of confidence. Um, I joked with you, like pumping my hands in the air, like, yes, that was something that I think I know I felt, and I imagine lots of kids could identify with as well. I love that, to write the book you wish you had as a child. Yeah, that's it. That's the power of book.
It
We
truly
keep
is.
seeing, yeah, we see. Oh, I love it. So tell me about what you're working on now. You've got two beautiful picture books in the world. What might come next? The things that you might be able to reveal.
Yes. So in the course of writing and sort of thinking about how to do Out of the Blue, another idea popped up, because I was doing a lot of research on marine ecosystems. And fun fact, am actually deathly afraid of the ocean. So in parallel to this ode to quiet children and finding your confidence and place in the world, I also started to itch and wanted to tell a story about fear and the overcoming of it.
Mhm.
So I am working on a story for slightly older readers that is sort of the more horror leaning version of this story. There is an ocean, there is a little girl, and maybe she overcomes fear, maybe she doesn't.
I love that. So not only are you kind of writing, gosh, I was thinking as you were saying is in writing this story, it's almost like you're trying to rewrite your own story, how you feel, and kind of getting over that. So you are a research lover, I can tell, because you have thrown in so many cool facts throughout this that have gone into your books. Were you always like that? Do you just love learning new things?
Yes, that is a very kind way of saying that I'm a huge nerd. um, I I do like to read. Like I mentioned briefly that I leaned more academic before I did the art, film, and writing track. And it's something that I can't, it's just in me. Whenever I feel stuck on a story, that's the first thing I do. Because often something that you stumble upon will unlock a story element in your head. And
Yeah,
that was certainly true for these two books. And when you start working on longer projects, I feel like that's especially essential because you have to sustain sort of that thing that ignited the idea in the beginning. And I I actually find it very hard to write, which is a weird thing to say for someone who writes professionally.
okay.
Um, but it takes a lot for me to try to weave in all of the elements. And I like having something that's rooted in something you can point to in the real world,
Mhm.
which is why both of these books lean STEM. So it's just especially exciting to be able to weave elements that people can research themselves that might inspire a kid to look up marine biology. Who knows?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I love that. I love reading with a device close by so that I can Google, certain things. And I did Google bioluminescence because
Yes.
first of all, I was like, that's a really long word to make sure I was saying it correctly. But I did Google that. It brought up, some of the pictures of when I went to the aquarium in Boston with my family. And so it did help make those connections. And I love what you said about using research kind of as your go-to to get out of a writing rut or just to give you inspiration because that's what I tend to do in my not when I need writing inspiration, but when I just need life inspiration, my first go-to is to just find a book, find a
Yep.
character who can help me, find a nonfiction personal development book that can get me unstuck. So I love that you naturally do that in your writing life too.
Yeah, it's always been that way. I can't remember a time where that wasn't the case. And again, we've talked about like what is the purpose of books? I feel like that is the purpose of books. Like when you find yourself stuck for whatever reason, it's a world that you can literally open up. And
Yes.
Google gives you so much more access to all of this informative resources. It's just amazing. It's an
Yeah.
amazing time to be alive.
It is. It is. And both of your books they're beautiful gifts for readers so that they can learn something new. They can escape for a little bit to another world because those pictures are so inviting. And then, spark a new way of thinking about the world or themselves, which is such a beautiful message. Oh. So where can readers find you and your books? What's the best way to find you online?
Yes, so you can find me at myname.com, so nicyulo.com. And the books are sold at most places where you can find books. A lot of indie bookstores have been extremely supportive. You can find a sort of compilation of links on the Penguin Random House pages for each of the books. And then you can choose whichever store is more convenient for you or is in your area if you want to pick them up physically. And yes, most of my handles are under my name, so I'm very searchable.
Good. That's good. And I'll put links to them inside of the show notes so that readers, listeners, both can
Both.
just click on them and find you that way too.
Amazing.
Oh, thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation. I feel privileged to get to know the backstory a little bit behind both of them and look forward to whatever one comes next in the future. We'll have to have you back on to talk about that
For
when it's
sure. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I remember when you emailed, you said that this podcast launched on November 3. That's my birthday. So I was like, that's
oh,
really fun.
perfect
Fun
timing. I
fact.
love it.
Yes.
Yep. I love those kind of little synchronicities that,
Yes.
fortunate, what was it? Fortunate
Detour.
detours.
Yes. Thank you
Well,
so, so much.
oh, you're so welcome. Thank you. And thank you for listening, everyone. And I'll see you inside the next episode. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Kid Lit Love podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing, and everything in between to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a bookish friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of kid lit love. Thanks for listening.